A young man named Grayson, who was a NASA employee, had a task to monitor the parameters of Voyager 1. And for 2 days already, he had been looking for confirmation of some strange data. Measurements from the sun's position sensor indicated a slight acceleration of the spacecraft. Voyager 1, the spacecraft farthest from Earth at that moment, which had already left the heliosphere, clearly began to accelerate slightly. At 3 o'clock, NASA Scientific Council was called. They discussed possible reason of the acceleration. Also, right during the meeting, new data was received on a sudden decrease in the magnetic field strength, as well as changes in some other measured parameters. The Council suggested that the spacecraft had begun to leave the so-called stagnation area and was now heading for outer space. The news of the anomaly with the space probe spread around the world. The next day, an update appeared that communication with Voyager 1 had been lost. For several days, NASA staff tried to re-establish communication, but all in vain. Eventually, it was decided to direct the camera of the New Horizons interplanetary probe to the point in the sky where Voyager 1 was last located. The telescope was able to capture a trace, a dim flash where the probe had exploded. This event was also broadcast on all media channels. However, something remained behind the scenes and was still being studied. After the probe was destroyed, something that was believed to be a cloud of debris remained and continued to move. At the very least, there was clearly some kind of trace at the site of the outbreak. The pictures of that trail were also circulating in the news the following days. But within NASA, it was decided not to disclose the fact that the debris trail had rapidly increased over the course of several days and looked quite grotesque in its linear dimensions compared to a relatively small spacecraft like Voyager. But that was not the most striking thing. Several observatories reported that immediately after Voyager's explosion, an inexplicable phenomenon was recorded that could be described as nothing more or less than the vibrations of stars. It was as if a transparent wave had spread from the explosion and was reaching the areas of the sky around the impact site for several hours. Thanks to Northern European and Asian space laboratories, the phenomenon also leaked to the press and was widely discussed. 5 years later, a new, more elaborate telescope was launched into orbit. Its technical regulations provided for a host of cutting-edge research. But in fact, the main purpose to put it into orbit as quickly as possible was to study the spot. The spot was the place where the Voyager 1 probe exploded with the cloud of its leftovers that has not changed its position since then. Over these years, Grayson has grown to become a senior NASA employee. On that day, he and many other specialists were waiting for the first photos of the spot in the data processing room. Finally, the image was received, roughly processed, and displayed on the screen. The screen showed a fuzzy image of what looked like an impact crater with a central black dot, a ring of debris around it, and 2 fainter long streaks extending in 2 opposite directions from the impact point. It was decided to change the settings and take a second picture. 3 hours later, a clear image was finally obtained. When the image appeared on the screen, the room fell silent. It was a trace of a hit. Even light-colored fragments and radial stripes were visible, and all this was lying as if on the surface of some long belt, with 2 long, dull stripes that diverged in 2 opposite directions and sharpened closer to the edge. All of this together resembled a compass arrow with 2 sharp edges and a black crater at its center. Someone in the room said, "It looks like we broke through some kind of glass." Everyone was silent, because it did look like that. Grayson interrupted this spellbound atmosphere with his cheerful words, "So let's start processing the data. What do we really know about it?" A week later, in the data processing room, different views of the spot were flashing on different screens in different spectral ranges. Right next to the crater, the stars of the constellation of the Serpentine were shining, in which Voyager was on its way. And one small star shone directly through the crater. Moreover, studies have shown a significant increase in the brightness of this star in different spectra. After 2 more years of research and comparison of shockwave data, it became clear that there could be only one explanation for this phenomenon, and it coincided with the very first reaction expressed in the audience about the broken glass. This explanation assumed the existence of some kind of hard, transparent shell around the solar system. This shell was immediately called the Firmament of Heaven, or simply firmament. By deliberately selecting the wavelengths and direction of the radiation, scientists managed to achieve interference effects and determine the geometric parameters of the shell. After studying the spectrum of the spot, it became clear that the firmament consists of a layer of water ice formed from chemically super pure water. The shell had the shape of a sphere and enwrapped the solar system. By that time, they had already learned how to build spacecrafts and give them gravitational acceleration around the sun so that the path Voyager had been traveling for decades could be covered many times faster. Over the next 12 years, 2 guided probes visited the firmament in the area of the spot. The probes confirmed that the material of the firmament was in fact extremely pure water ice. Sonar studies also revealed that the shell is microscopic in thickness by stellar standards, about 50 meters thick at the point where Voyager hit it. It was also determined that on the outside of this shell there is a thin layer of liquid, most likely several centimeters thick, which moves very quickly on the surface of the ice. By all physical indications, this liquid was also the same pure water that made up the ice of the sphere. Due to the friction on the ice surface and the absence of particles for crystallization, the water was in a stable liquid state. The movement of the water on the other side of the solid created an interesting sound picture of constant singing. This sound, similar to the singing flow of the theremin sounds, was transmitted through the probe supports when they touched the surface of the firmament. It was determined that immediately after the collision, an elongated island of frozen ice, pointed on both sides, formed at the exit of the hole Voyager had created, with fast-moving liquid water washing its shores from east to west. The water movement had stopped and balanced the further growth of the ice crystallization zone. It was this island that made the entire crater look like a compass arrow with 2 points at the ends. Also, during the stay on the firmament, the probes recorded and photographed single translucent flashes, probably of an electromagnetic nature, similar to the northern lights, not long streaks like on Earth, but in the form of separate projections of ghostly light. Photos of these unexplained effects also circulated around the world. Some people saw them as the northern lights, others saw them as the wings of angels, and still others thought they resembled the phoenix bird. That's why the flashes were called phoenixes. Back when the second research probe was being prepared for its mission to the firmament, a manned flight program was already underway. It was a great mission, for which the spacecraft was to be assembled from several parts in orbit at the first stage, and then accelerated around the sun to reach the firmament. The main task of the mission was to land near the crater and go through the hole that Voyager had made to the opposite side of the firmament, install equipment, and conduct research. The manned flight was several times more expensive and difficult than the unmanned one, but scientists argued that the project should be manned due to the complexity of the tasks to be performed. However, almost all experts agreed that what humanity really wanted was to finally fulfill its long-standing vainest dream, namely, to reach the sky limit. All countries of the world joined in the creation or financing of the project. The flight was supposed to take at least 5 years in one direction. There were only 2 people on the ship's crew, a man and a woman. Some people called them Adam and Eve, or Barbie and Ken, but their real names were Claude and Michelle. At the time of the launch, he was 30 and she was 27 years old. The Unity spacecraft they piloted was assembled in orbit. And finally the day came when they had to get on and guide Unity to the stars, or rather to what separated them from the stars. It was a day to remember for everyone. Claude and Michelle waved happily from the bridge before climbing into the rocket. Many world leaders came to personally wish them success. Conspiracy theorists saw some symbols in the design of their costumes and equipment. The very name of the ship, Unity, was considered by conspiracy theorists to be a reference to the Tower of Babel, the construction of which once ended in chaos and disunity. But in any case, there was really too much symbolism in the preliminary ceremonies and in the designs of the flight. But it was understandable. After all, so many countries and cultures joined the mission, and the very philosophy of this flight could not take place without the ceremonies of various organizations. There were at least a couple of dozen boxes of flags and messages from different parts of the world that the astronauts were to deliver to outer space. However, the ceremonies came to an end, and in a few hours they were already in orbit. The 2-person team was boarding the Unity. At that moment, Claude felt a terrible chill, because even years of training could not fully prepare a man for the moment of realizing that 5 years of flying to the firmament are ahead. Only beloved Michelle his company. Michelle was also clearly in a state of emotional overwhelm after all these ceremonies among a bunch of people, which suddenly ended with the transition to a lonely time capsule from which she would now not come out for 10 years, provided that she ever returned to Earth in the first place. But as their experience later showed, the flight time to the firmament did not seem as long as it might have been. The newest methods of communication on the tangled particles made full-fledged instant communication possible. During this time, Claude and Michel watched all the new series and learnt new languages, delighting fans from around the world. They also learned to cook interesting national dishes, using the ingredients on the ship. Numerous online broadcasts and blogging took up a lot of their time. Another feature of the flight was their forced isolation from each other for periods of several weeks to 2 months. This was done to artificially restore their emotional connection. During these periods, they could take turns visiting the central part of the ship and leaving messages and surprises on the dining room table. The spectators on the ground were delighted every time the prisoners were finally released from their prisons and reunited in the central part of the ship. There were a few hours left before the landing, and the astronauts were anxiously preparing for the main part of the mission. Through the ship's window, they could already clearly see the crater near which they were to land. The firmament had a very weak gravity. Claude switched the spacecraft to landing mode while Michel was monitoring the instrumentation data. The engines automatically performed maneuvers to balance the ship. The vehicle was approaching the black and very smooth ice of the firmament very smoothly, almost imperceptibly. Outside the window, Claude saw the same flashes. The phoenixes. It was difficult to determine their size. Perhaps they were huge and distant, or small and close. They seemed to appear a meter or two above the surface of the ice, which glistened with its polished black surface, slightly bumpy from this angle. Finally, only 1 meter remained to the surface. A second later, the ship's props touched down. The whole Earth, watching the action live on TV, burst into applause when the ship finally stopped. Immediately after touching the surface, the Unity ship was filled with the same enchanting singing that the rushing water on the other side of the firmament created. The people on the ground watched Claude and Michel, fascinated by this sound, look around the walls and ceiling of the ship, listening to this amazing music that now seemed to come from everywhere inside the ship. But this audio effect was expected, so soon the astronauts began preparing to go to the surface. The hatch opened, and Claude, dressed in a spacesuit, slowly took a few steps down. Michel stood at the top of the stairs and watched him. The planet was waiting with bated breath for the first words. Most believed that they would be the same words Armstrong had once said. It's a small step for man and a giant leap for mankind. But in reality, no one knew what Claude would say when he stepped on the firmament. Even NASA itself did not impose any of the speech options on him, but left them to his personal choice. During the flight, the audience had asked him hundreds of times what he would say when he set foot on the firmament, but Claude would only joke and remind them that they had to get there first. As he descended the stairs, he was silent, and only his breathing was to be heard. Just as his feet hit the surface, he cried, "Suckers!" Claude grabbed the railing. "My God, I almost did a split!" Realizing that this was what he had finally said when he literally stepped on the sky, Claude laughed. Michel laughed with him too, and the whole Earth that was watching. It was just that the large orange soft structures with a suction cup effect on the soles of his suit did not immediately adapt and stabilize. Claude explained to all the viewers of the broadcast what had happened. Michel carefully followed him down and exclaimed, "Oh shit, I'm fine, but my legs really slipped in the first second. Then the grip stabilizes." The planet was momentarily filled with memes about this landing, how the word suckers was sent to people by gods painted on ancient frescoes, or how God in heaven suddenly hears the word suckers and other jokes. While the funny memes were spreading across the Earth, Claude and Michel had taken out and set up the equipment that was to remain on this side of the firmament, and they were preparing a sled loaded with additional equipment and all the things they needed to go to the other side. Claude looked around. All around him, among the endless black sea of ice, were white stones left over from the collision. Somewhere above, far above him, the bright star of the sun, which was the core of this huge bubble on which they were standing, was shining. At a distance of 100 meters from them, colorful phoenixes hovered and slowly shimmered on the shiny black surface. Michel stopped and joined him in watching the spectacle. From this angle, the phoenixes seemed alive. Or rather, they felt alive. They really resembled some kind of birds made of magical, playful light, each glowing with its own shade. Orange, yellow, green. You could even imagine where their wings and eyes were. Michelle said for the record, "We are witnessing the Phoenix phenomenon. These flashes of light are really fascinating." "Hey!" Claude waved to the phoenixes. "Greetings!" Suddenly, one blue phoenix changed shape. Its tongue seemed to spread out like wings. It got up and moved to the other side. Claude and Michelle got back to work. They rigged up the sledge and pulled it towards the hole, the edges of which were surrounded by chunks of ice that Voyager had broken. Standing on the edge of the circular hole, through which they could see the bright stars on the other side, was a rather eerie sight. Michelle, sensing Claude's nervousness, even suggested a little breathing exercise to calm them down. The phoenixes came closer, surrounding the tunnel and the astronauts. Now they looked even more alive, majestic, and silent. "The phoenixes have moved towards the tunnel," Claude reported to the ground. These stellar, colorful, shape-shifting birds seemed to be watching the travelers who had entered their world. "Don't focus on them," came a voice from Earth. "Continue with the mission." But Claude and Michelle kept watching the phoenixes for some time after. It was difficult to look away from the spectacle. Finally, they set off on this short 50-meter passage out of the solar system. When they were about halfway through the tunnel, Claude stopped and looked around. A small but bright sun was shining on one side of the tunnel, and the stars were shining on the other. And all this was accompanied by the sound of singing water, which was now louder. Their legs trembled slightly from the intensity of the moment. They continued on their way and came to the other side of the tunnel. "We're in the sky," Michelle said happily. "Yes, we are here," Claude confirmed. They were standing on a low, very elongated, icy, jagged island that was formed by the impact of Voyager. 100 meters away they could see the edge of the island and beyond it, an endless black mirror of rushing water reflecting the universe. The stars and nebulae were much brighter here. For a while, the two people standing on the ice island in the middle of the endless black ocean were watching real space. "At least now we can see for sure that the stars are not made up," Claude joked. "How do you know? It remains to be proven," the jolly voice of Grayson, who was the leader of the entire mission, replied to the joke. "Set up the equipment. We will start observing." On the other side of the crater, the second nearest shore of the island was visible. On the other two sides, the island stretched in long somewhere far away in both directions. Stepping on their large, soft orange suction cups, which automatically deformed like a sponge to the shape of the island's icy outcrops, Claude and Michelle dragged their sled to the shore nearest to them. Claude directed the light onto the dark surface of the rushing water, the sound of which sang through their suits. The water glistened in long lines of taut streaks. The astronauts began deploying the equipment on the island. When all the stargazing instruments were installed, the ice samples collected, and the lighting set up and switched on, they moved on to the boxes. There were various painted boxes, mostly made of gold, and decorated with precious stones of different shapes and sizes, some signs, flags, and a lot of other mementos and toys that the Earthlings wanted to leave in heaven. Claude and Michelle took turns commenting in different languages with words of gratitude as each of the artifacts was placed. When the installation was complete, they headed for the shore. The white ice of the island broke off abruptly, and water rushed right behind it at a very high speed. It was the purest water of the space, which did not freeze due to its extreme purity and rapid friction against the ice. There were no particles in it that would allow crystallization. Michelle sat down by the water. They both remembered the warning not to touch the water, as this could lead to unpredictable crystallization. Michelle stretched out her hand playfully. Claude filmed it. Grayson's voice came through the earpiece, reminding them once again not to touch the water. The water was dark, and the distance seemed deceptive. Michelle's shoe suddenly slipped, and she fell off her feet. "No!" Claude shouted, and in an attempt to hold on to Michelle, he suddenly stepped into the water. The black water around his foot instantly disappeared, turning into a surface of ice. There was an explosive crystallization of water. For some time they assessed the situation, which was extremely unpleasant but solvable. Claude brought out a portable cutter he had with him for such an occasion. After a while, they freed Claude's leg from the ice trap. When they finished rescuing Claude, they finally looked around. There was no more island. All they could see was gray ice. In the headphones, they could hear confused words from the Earth about crystallization, and that it should not have happened. After a while, Claude and Michel were hurrying towards the exit to return through the tunnel to the solar system. As they were approaching the opening, they suddenly saw the phoenixes fly out of the tunnel one by one. They flew up to the stars, danced in shimmering flames, and then disappeared into the darkness. The phoenixes were gone. Without their presence, it somehow became very cold, unpleasant, and lonely in this icy desert. On the other side of the ice, the ship was waiting for them in the same place. There was not a single flash of the phoenixes anywhere. Claude felt a tremendous, heartfelt sorrow, as if they had accidentally destroyed some eternal harmony that had reigned here since the creation of the world. Michel remained silent, feeling the same anguish and guilt. "Has the landscape changed?" Claude radioed back to Earth. "Is the crystallization spot bigger?" "Yes, we're observing it," replied Grayson. "How big is it now?" Michel asked, hoping for the best. "It's still growing," Grayson answered disappointingly. The ship, in which they had spent 5 years, and which they would have thought would be extremely sickening, felt very warm, homely, and cozy. They were very happy to be able to start the journey back to Earth. The takeoff and entry into the trajectory were almost automatic. They kept an eye on the instruments, but their hearts were restless because of what had happened. On the second day of the flight, they were mostly depressed, sitting by the window. Where once there had been space, there was now a huge dark spot, with stars continuing to disappear around its edges. The flight back was very difficult emotionally because of the events on Earth. The entire Earth has been in a political and cultural crisis. Over the past year, Claude and Michel have been approached by the third U.S. government already, and numerous new leaders of other countries. Grayson reported that 5% of the sky had become an impenetrable blind spot. The constellation of the Serpentine, to which Voyager was once heading, has disappeared from the sky. The consequences of humans touching the water of the heavens were terrible, but it seemed to be a secondary issue for the Earthlings. There was such a global crisis raging that Claude and Michel were not sure that the territory of their landing would still be the United States, and not some other quasi-state. By the time they landed on Earth, the spot had covered a third of the entire visible universe, but fortunately, data showed that its growth had stopped there. At least 2/3 of the visible cosmos remained. Many scientists silently cursed the mission for possibly distorting so much of the visible cosmos forever. And no one understood the long-term consequences of creating such a screen over a third of the solar system. The news of Claude and Michel's return went almost unnoticed. The flow of information around the world at the time was chaotic. Each part of the world was broadcasting its own truth. Claude and Michel, in a hurry, disappeared into the crowd. They did not appear in the media space again and did not give any interviews. In any case, humanity did not care about them or even about the stars, some of which disappeared from the sky. Everyone was focused on their local problems, crisis, and survival. Eventually, the crisis ended when a politician came on stage and started talking about unity again. But this time, it was not about the spaceship. The end. The Firmament of Heaven by Denis Okhrimenko. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.